Professor Alan Macfarlane, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
Alan, you are an extremely interesting character with a storied background in your field of anthropology. You've surveyed a great many peoples across the globe and what makes them distinct and different. And as an Englishman, as someone who's a Brit, I am interested in what it is that makes the English particularly unique. And I suppose in an era where, if we speak of national character specific to the English, I think it's probably fair to say that from some quarters you can be accused of an English exceptionalism, if we speak of a national character at all. And so you have done some quite extensive work many years ago, which is still very popular, on the origins of English individualism. It was titled, that book. And so I would like to begin, Alan, with you outlining briefly some of the characteristics of the English people and how it came to be that way.
Thank you. Well, to start with, Adam Smith said, no, it was David Hume who said, the English have no national character unless not having a national character is a national character. Second thing to qualify it is that I'm not an Englishman, I'm a Scotsman, or rather I'm 5/8 Scots, 1/8 Welsh, and so on. And the third is that what I'm talking about are perhaps now not quite so true, because England has changed hugely in its character over the last generation anyway. So England now is a hodgepodge of different nationalities, obviously. But sort of boiling it down to its essence of what I was describing in the 1970s, 80s, the English were regarded by people on the continent, for example, as a peculiar people. Voltaire, when he came to England, famously said, "I have come to a civilization which in no way resembles my own, i.e. France." So you can just go through them. I'll just go through them very quickly. First is political. The kind of centralized feudalism, which was traditional in England as a political system, which then led into the first modern democracy, is unique, except, according to Mark Bloch, Japan, which had a very similar political system for a long time, but it didn't have the democracy. So the political system is unique, and that's why it spread all over the world and why it led to the foundation of America and everything else. Secondly, its language is unique. It obviously overlaps with Dutch and Scandinavian and so on, but it has various unique features and is very long and continuous since the English accents. And that's the second reason why it's spread all over the world. The third is its legal system is unique. The common law system and, again, other additions, such as the system of trusts and so on, is unique, although obviously it was then taken to America and there's an overlap there, but it's totally different from the Roman law tradition of the continent. Its economic system is unique. It's the first capitalist society going back 1,000 years. In other words, a society which separates off the economy from the society, as Max Weber described it, and has extensive use of money markets, has a fully developed private property system from 800 years ago, and so is capitalist to 3 centuries before Marx and Weber thought it was. Its religion is unique, the kind of Puritan Protestant religion from the 16th century, and even before, it had tinges of all that, is overlaps obviously with the Dutch and so on, but very distinctive features to the religion. Its poetry is unique. It's got to be the two greatest poetic traditions to my mind, the other being the Chinese, which, if you mix in with the drama, Shakespeare and so on, means that English literature is read and spread all over the world. Those are some of them. I could go on, but I'll just mention three that are famous. One is its children's stories. There's no other country in the world that creates the kind of Harry Potter type, Ring in the Willows type, Alice in Wonderland type children's stories. Other traditions have other kinds of children's stories, but not those. The second is its humor is unique. The kind of irony and deadpan and completely mad Monty Python, like all the satirical tradition going back to Pope and Dryden and so on. And everyone says when they come to England, the first thing you need to learn is how to make a joke or how to take a joke. And then the last thing is its games tradition, the reason why the modern religion of the world, which is football, is so important. It came from England. It was invented in England. Most of the team games, cricket and so on, were invented or adapted sometimes, like hockey, from Scotland. But so games playing is another feature. So the culture, the society, the economy, the ideology are all unique in the sense that they are more developed in a certain direction than in other countries here. Obviously, there's an overlap with, say, lowland Scotland or say, Holland or Scandinavia.
There are many threads to pull on there. I'll only pull on a couple. The first, when you opened with how we were viewed by visitors from the continent, I think it's interesting when you read your book and you have got excerpts of Venetian travellers and Frenchmen coming over, and their accounts typically follow themes like the English are sure of themselves, they're very well dressed, they love liberty above all, they don't like being told what to do, they like wealth, and as you say, even as far back as the 1300s, it was capitalistic, and we'll come back to that in a moment because they might all be surprising to lots of people. And we ourselves, when you read accounts, I can't remember who wrote it, but there is someone you quote that was writing in 1559 who didn't see us on this island as being hard done by. In fact, there seems to be this sentiment that we were blessed because everyone on the continent ate salads whilst we had meat. We had this beautiful island and we had freedom that the continentals didn't have because of the lack of peasantry. And again, I think we'll get onto that in a moment. But the capitalistic element, Alan, I think it's common for people to think that it was the Industrial Revolution that ultimately turned us into a capitalistic peoples, and it was a big rupture from what went before. But as you outline in your book, from many records that you surveyed, you could find it all the way back to the 1300s. Why do you think it is that we have the view we do about when that change happened being more around the 18th century rather than back in the 14th, which you had discovered?
Well, just to add to my list, one of the things you mentioned was that we don't eat, well, we eat meat and we are well clothed, and this is another peculiar feature of the English for back as far as the records certainly said in Chaucer in the 14th century and onwards. That is a peculiarly affluent, wealthy island for various reasons. Now, as to why we think, or many people, I mean, if you talk to ordinary people and say, when did we, whatever word you like to use, become modern, become capitalist, or whatever they use, they'll usually say it was probably the 18th century, 19th century, that sort of period. And this is because it was a big rupture. It was on the surface, there was a huge change with industrialization and urbanization. So if we are peculiar now, it seems likely that that would be the turning point. And people without history, much historical training, would think that. What is rather odd is that many historians came to believe that. What I discovered in writing the book was that the general view in the late 19th century of people like Maitland, Acton, Stubbs, Froude, all the great historians of that period, Green and others, was that the English had a continuous history, that the Industrial Revolution, of course, was important, but that if you looked at any institutions, they were all set down very early. A nice example is the great history of English law by Maitland and Pollock and Maitland. When does English law end? In other words, they are writing a great 2-volume history of English law. When do they stop? They stop in about 1300. In other words, nothing much has happened since 1300. Now, the law is both a reflection and a creator of everything else. So if you don't change your legal systems, it's unlikely that suddenly some other part of your society, like your economic system and capitalism, will suddenly emerge without the law being changed. There was no need because nothing much happened. Now, what happened was that after about the First World War, the historians in this country, particularly in the Second World War, many of them became very left-wing. They saw what had happened in the communist revolution. They became socialists. And so many of the best social historians and others, like R.H. Tawney or E.P. Thompson, they tried to apply Marx, Weber, and modern sociological models to English history. And the broad Marxist Weberian sociological model says that England was feudal and pre-capitalist until the 15th century. And then there was a watershed and it changed in the 16th to 18th centuries. And this was reinforced by a strange thing, which is not easy to explain, but medieval history, in other words, making the medieval world feudal and peasant and pre-capitalist, medieval history was dominated by East Europeans. Kosminski, Poston, Vinogradov, Titov, Homans, all from East Europe. And they were many of the leading historians of that time. And what they did was say, well, we know that people before the 15th century were peasant feudal. Where else? What is the mental model we have? And they're from East Europe. So they impose Russian peasantry or Polish peasantry or East European peasantries onto medieval England. And in other words, the paradigm shifts and creates a threefold Marxist model: pre-capitalist, transitional, capitalist. And I was taught all this at Oxford. I was taught by all the great social writers, E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, R.H. Hilton, Christopher Hill particularly. He took this for granted that we had gone through the same transition as everyone else, but a couple of centuries earlier. And so it was only through a set of chances, because if you have a paradigmatic breakthrough, as I think I created, for example, Lawrence Stone, who was another of these people, when he reviewed my book in the London Review of Books, said if Macfarlane is right, he is the Einstein of history. In other words, it was And then, of course, he said, of course, he's wrong and it's rubbish. But um, it was a hostage to fortune, because it turns out that many people think I was roughly right. Um, to make that kind of breakthrough, you can't do it intellectually. It's an emotional and psychological break against what you've been taught about, against your teachers. It may well lose you your job. If I had remained a historian, for example, I probably couldn't have said this, because I would have never got a history job. But because I moved into anthropology, and I had a safe, secure place there, the historians could say, oh, well, he's not a historian, etc. So it was a set of chances. I can tell you what the other chances were if you're interested, but basically it was one of those eureka moments when you're suddenly, the whole world alters, because what we think of our history determines very much what we think of ourselves. It is a myth or story of our origins, and we interpret our present world very much in the light of our unexamined assumptions about our past.
It would definitely be interesting to hear the other chances, but that last point you made there, the assumptions of the past, and how they impact us in the present. So you've outlined how there wasn't a peasantry, as far as you could tell, in England in the periods that these social historians post-World War II posited, and that we've all come to think, which is that pre-capitalist, capitalist society, whatever. But I suppose what you found was, you find there were lots of land transfers between peoples of all different classes. People weren't particularly attached to the land. They're quite happy to sell things on, even if they had a small amount. And this was happening through all the records you could find, which is remarkable. I suppose the question I've got, Alan, if I look at today, so we have, if I look around the cities, we are building lots of small box light flats. People are increasingly becoming leaseholders rather than freeholders. We are not really a nation of shopkeepers or innkeepers or smiths anymore, able to be self-governing and self-sufficient in some way and live in that Adam Smith world of trade in your own interest, but it benefits everyone else. And instead, we are employed by increasingly faceless, unrooted corporations, or a big public sector which is covering a big geographical region rather than a localized one. And I suppose the question I'm asking then is, and before I do ask that question, again, that Venetian traveller I was referring to earlier, he remarked in the passage in your book that there's no small innkeeper, however poor and humble he may be, who does not serve his table with silver dishes and drinking cups. And then again, talking about wearing very fine clothes. And if I look around at all of those things we just talked about, plus, our cheap IKEA furniture and crockery that we adorn our houses in, and we wear athleisure rather than small clothes, I ask, have we come up with a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we're almost becoming like a peasantry, a landless peasantry with none of those accoutrements? I know I'm asking you to do some modern-day social commentary here rather than your field, but what do you make of that?
Well, the first thing that people watching this need to know is what we mean by peasantry. Most people, when you say peasant, they think, and I thought, just a country dweller, someone who works on the land, doesn't own it, probably working for someone else. So it's a farm labourer, really, or a farm smallholder. I was using peasant in a technical sense taken from anthropology, which means that a peasant is someone who owns or rents or has land, but they work it with their family. So it's sometimes called the family mode of production or domestic mode of production. So it means that you use family labour, so your children work for you, they inherit the land, brothers work together, and so on. So it is the overlap of the social structure, peasant of their family system, with the economy. So the unit of production, in Marx's sense, is the family, not the individual. And capitalism comes about when you break this, and the unit becomes the individual who earns for themselves, who owns and keeps the rewards of their labor and so on, and doesn't have to, for example, pay for their parents' old age if they don't want to. There's no law they have to. They don't have to bring up their brother's children if their brother is poor or anything. There is extreme individualism in every field. So that's what I mean by peasant. And not peasant, in capitalism. In that sense, these people who I see sprouting all over Cambridge, we have, I think, a big Dutch firm called Marley, which is creating these little boxes all over Cambridgeshire. And as you say, they're filled with people fairly identical furniture and wearing fairly similar clothes and not having gardens and not having shops, and the pubs are disappearing and all the rest of it. They're not, I think it's probably wrong to think that they're going back to peasantry in any sense. But if you said they are landless workers who are living with pretty basic conditions around them, and we move from householding civilization to this, that's probably true, and it's part of this hollowing out of the social structure. So the middle class and the lower middle class and the upper middle class are disappearing, and you're getting a two-structure society here in America, or Piketty's work, for example, whereby you have a very small number of uber rich, and everyone else is a drone. It's more like it's a kind of beehive. There's one or two queen bees and others, and then the rest of us are drones. That is certainly something we're moving towards. On the other hand, one shouldn't overdo it, because although people living in such box-like environs, they're pretty rich, and they'll probably have 2 cars, or certainly have 1 car. They'll have a lot of consumer durables, which are quite valuable. Their income, since I was a child, their income has gone up at least 4-fold from the 1950s. So compared to other parts of the world, the per capita income is still very high, but it's going into rather kind of what we now consider less stylish, I would say, at least clothing and food and so on. So there has been a big change.
I agree. I could go down a rabbit hole. I have a habit of doing that, but there's much more that I want to cover. But also, not least, that you, before I asked you that question, you were talking about the chance moments which led you to your realization that saw you not necessarily fated as the Einstein of history, but sounds like you may well have been on the money. So let's grant you that title now. What were the other chances that gave you this earth-shattering worldview change about the people of England?
I think it's mainly 2 things. One is that I was trained as a historian in Kent. I did an undergraduate degree and a postgraduate degree at Oxford in history. And then I was, for various reasons, attracted to anthropology, and I retrained and did another master's and another PhD in anthropology. And as part of that, explicitly, I wanted to go and see what it was like to live in the kind of society which I had been studying. In other words, a supposedly pre-capitalist, pre-industrial society, to actually sense it, not just to read about it. So I went and spent 15 months in central Nepal, in the Himalaya mountains, in a very remote village with no electricity and no roads and no nothing. And that showed me what a real peasantry was like. People working flat out for at least most of the time, living on very insufficient food, very simple housing, a family mode of production, and so on. So I sensed what it was to be a peasant. And that gave me a backdrop which no other historians had, because none of them do this. I then came back and returned to being a historian for a while. And the second thing that happened is that I started a project. In the 1950s, 60s, local government became much wealthier in this country. And as a result, they set up proper archival offices, record offices. And the leading one was in Essex. And I had the good fortune to be studying witchcraft in Essex, so I knew the Essex Record Office. Well, I knew the wealth of records which were becoming visible both there and in the Public Record Office for the first time. The past had been buried, more or less. There were people like Maitland who went into the archives, but most historians didn't actually go into the archives, and they weren't even there. They were sitting in solicitors' offices and church vestries and things. They all came into these record offices. And I was of the first generation of social historians who was allowed to go in and look at these things. And so I was absolutely, it was like seeing, a new ocean or new continent. The whole world was suddenly revealed in a way that even my teachers had never seen it. So I set up a project which turned out to be the longest project of its kind and the only one of its kind that's ever been done, which is to collect all the records of one village in Essex, Earlscone, from when they began, which is about 1380, through to 1860, and to transcribe them, and then later to put them into a computer and analyze them. Now, no one has ever done that before or since, because it's a huge amount of work. It's all up on the University of Cambridge server. So if you put in Earlscone, you will find the website which has all the records there and the maps and everything. And what I expected when I did that was that as I moved from 1380 through 1480, 1580, the records would change. In other words, something dramatic would happen because there was a capitalist revolution. What I found was that they didn't change. Minor modifications, obviously, but the records, the courts, the court structure, and the kind of arguments and the kind of sentiments and everything else in those records didn't alter. And what they showed was nothing like what I'd seen in the Himalayas. They showed a far more affluent, far more fluid, everyone moving around, being born in one place, going to another place, dying in another place. They didn't show a family inheritance of property, except sometimes. They didn't show any sharing of property between brothers or parents and children. And above all, and you mentioned a Venetian traveller, one of them was later a pope. And his brilliant insight into the English was a key. He said the English are very peculiar because when they have their children, when their children are very young, 12 or younger, they send them away from their homes. And he said this would be understandable if they then had them back into their homes, but they never come back. And so what he was describing is this break between the family and society, because people send their children, if they're working class, they send them off as servants. They're a bit higher up, they send them off as apprentices. They're a bit higher up, they send them off as pages to a noble family. Or the great British public school tradition, they send them off to boarding schools from 14th, 15th century onwards, and before. The boarding school is the oldest institution in England. The first boarding school was in the 6th century, in Canterbury. So sending your children away, telling them you are no longer part of your parents' family, you are on your own, you have to make your way. You will keep what you find, you will choose your husband or wife for yourself, you will start again. That this Venetian found very heartless and unkind, but it is the key to the breaking of the nexus between the family and the economy. And that goes right back. So the combination of an anthropological experience and first-hand contact with many, many, many documents, transcribing them over the years, I think those two things put together, plus the social history revolution, which I was part of in the 60s, 70s, which turned attention away from kings and queens and the top echelons of society down to ordinary people in their villages and so on, and the growing interest in emotions and emotional history and psychohistory and the rest of it. All those things, it was the right time at the right place, and I also had a wonderful supervisor, Sir Keith Thomas, who encouraged me and who was at the forefront of the bringing together of history and anthropology in that period. So I had superb mentors, Jack Cody, Peter Laslett, Keith Thomas and others. I was in a wonderful environment. Cambridge in the 1970s was a wonderful place to be, as it still is. I had, above all, a superb helper in my wife, Sarah, who did much of the work on Earl's Cairn and who encouraged me and went out to Nepal with me later. So to do this, you need a kind of lifestyle and a set of fortunate circumstances. And the last tribute is to my mother, who I worked with a great deal, and we wrote books together on tea and things. So I had the right people around me, the right environment. There's a very good theory of creativity by a gentleman called Mihaly, and he said that creativity occurs at four levels. The national level. So England was the right place to be doing this. At the institutional level, Cambridge was the right institution to be doing this in because of the Cambridge Group and other things. The network level, I had the right network of people. And then the individual life experience level. And by good fortune, I had all these.
That's fascinating. What really was blowing apart something that I think I've always viewed, and I think is a common understanding of how the West, as it gets referred to, we all get lumped together, I suppose, is different to much of the other world, is that we're not really clannish. The family was broken down ultimately into that nuclear family, and it's typically seen to be down to popes in the Middle Ages who ultimately broke down that clannishness. But hearing you talk there and reading that book, and to understand that process seemed to have happened many centuries before on this island, rather than it being a top-down cultural change imposed by the Catholic Church. This almost sounds like it was an emergent bottom-up cultural change, and it happened so many centuries before, which is amazing. And there's something else that you were saying in there about because of the family being broken down into the nuclear unit, and the English being a very individualistic people. I don't know if you've come across the writer Louise Perry, but she recently wrote an article that was about modernity and its this technological modernity and its fate. And effectively, she was linking it to the declining demographics that you see across the West, as shown by the very low fertility rate, and that fertility rate is decreasing across every group of people as they go along that same path. And she was saying modernity is showing that perhaps it can't reproduce itself. And there were other things she was linking to it. Is it just that nature doesn't want to live this way? That's a totally separate question. But within all of this, I suppose she then says, perhaps our future is much like our past. It will be extended families living together in a more rooted place. And it made me think of a question, Alan, which is if culturally, for all of this time, that at least some of the peoples that inhabit this island, I appreciate, as we've mentioned, there are many different other peoples living here now. But if those peoples who've been here since the times we've been talking about have this long-running cultural trait, which is individualistic, nuclear family, moving around, it's not actually that there was even really a rooted experience of a family through the generations, as you've seen through the land transfers, is do we go back to a point that actually never really existed? So if modernity might be forcing us more to a rooted existence, bigger extended families, does culture win out against these pressures in the end? Does it hold up, or is it the world that in the end will end up changing the way we are?
Yeah, two separate things I'd like to mention there. One is modernity. He used the word. Most people don't know what modernity means, or rather, I think they don't know what modernity means in my sense. Most people, like this lady in Louise, seem to equate it with surface phenomena, technology. So that's part of the reason why people think the modern world began with the Industrial Revolution, because you get a change in the technologies, and that is modernity. So if you ask most people, what is it to be modern? They'd say, well, to drive a car and to have an iPhone and have, most young people, most intelligent people will associate modernity with the physical world. We've created science and technology, really. That's obviously part of it, but it's only a small part of it. At a much deeper level, my definition of modernity, and I've written about 6 books about which have the title modern in it, in them, the riddle of the modern world, the making of the modern world, the invention of the modern world, and so on. In all of them, I define within the meaning of modern, and it's taken from the great social thinkers, which is that modernity consists of separating out your life. So human beings have 4 great drives: towards wealth, and we call that economics; towards social warmth, and we call that society; towards power, and we call that politics; and towards striving for meaning and understanding, and we call that ideology. Those are the 4. In most civilizations, in simple societies, they're all together, so a tribal people. In peasantries, they split into 2 pairs. Politics and religion are together, and society and economy, as I've explained, is together. What modernity does is the final splitting apart. So you can pursue politics without worrying about religion or economics or your family. My uncle was a member of Parliament, and I know that if I'd asked him to do things privately on my behalf, he would have said, sorry, Alan, you're my nephew, but it's nothing to do with me, etc. And if his local priest had told him what to do, he wouldn't have done it necessarily. So this is modernity. Now, it's a fiction, because, of course, these things are influencing each other, and we often call that corruption, nepotism, helping your nephew. But it's a necessary fiction for freedom, because if you want to be operating freely in any of these fields, then you need to keep up the fiction that they are separate and inseparable. This is what England achieved in the medieval period to a large extent. Separation of God, the market, the family, and the king. They're separate things. And we've maintained it, and it's very deeply ingrained. And I personally, in answer to your question, think it will continue. Many groups in England don't, in much of their lives, subscribe to it. For example, if you're a Muslim or a Hindu or a Jew or whatever, you don't subscribe to the separation, say, between family and religion. You want to marry off your daughter and so on and so on. But England developed through its empire a tolerant system whereby you would allow a good deal of personal mixing of fields as long as it doesn't impinge on the general playing field on which people operate. So as long as you obey the laws, you pay your taxes, don't go around killing people, then what you eat, what you dress, wear, what you believe is up to you. So this allows a good deal of multicultural tolerance, which you don't find in the same way in many continental countries. So I think it will vary and it'll change and so on, but I don't think we will live in multi-generational peasant-type families. I mean, there are statistics showing that many more children are staying at home for much longer. But that has to be looked at rather carefully, because when I was studying this leaving home syndrome, I was also doing a study of my grandchildren. We lived down the road and I was filming them and watching them grow up and studying them in a way I couldn't with my own children. I saw that though they lived at home, stayed at home and went to school locally till they were 18, they'd basically made this separation when they were 11 or 12. In other words, their room had a notice on it, don't come out in it without my permission. They had their own pocket money and accounts. They decided what their interests were. And they built up a kind of understanding with their parents about their private space. And their parents were, and they were very soon aware that their most important people in their lives were their friends at school, rather than their parents. So they broke away. They didn't have to leave home to break away. And I suspect that if you look at many young people living at home, they're living in a bedsit, which might be in someone else's, but now they don't have to pay the rent. So they don't necessarily eat together and so on. So I think it is compatible with statistics showing much more co-residential activities. And even, bank of mum and dad or bank of nanny and grandpa is a bank. It's something you borrow money from. But they've lent you the money. They don't have to lend you the money. They can ask for it back. You can pay it back. So this very contractual relationships which you develop early on with your own family, I think is what will happen. And looking at it in reverse, I'm doing a lot of study of China. And the Chinese problem is the reverse. Are they going to lose their traditional, not peasant, but close familistic system? And I've been talking to a lot of young Chinese who say it's changed greatly, but it hasn't gone, and it won't. They still feel deeply bound up with their parents, with their siblings, with their wider relatives. They would still, if their cousin had a son who wanted to go to America, they'd still chip in with part of their salary to pay for them. If their parents are ill, they'll fly from England and go and look after them. It's very different, and it's remained different. And I think, given the huge change that's occurred in the last 25 years, it's gone about as far as it will go.
fascinating. There's so many examples within your book that suggest some of the biggest philosophical innovations or economic innovations or technological innovations or literary innovations have all come downstream from this national character. And to give a few examples, and it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on anything that I've missed, is you've got you mentioned this contractual relationship that we have with our families, and it makes me think of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan and this social contract theory. And that seems, when you understand your work and what you find, that seems like that could have only ever really taken place here, just like Adam Smith's idea of, the bakers, the butchers, they're not doing it for benevolence, they're doing it because it benefits them, but in the end it benefits everyone else by having this contractual agreement and able to trust that other people can produce for you, and you need to do stuff as well. And within your book, you also talked about how you can find repeatedly throughout any of the things that you've been reviewing, any of the documents, whether it's high society stuff or people's sentiments about where they live, that there's this deep connection with the land, that people have always seen the country as being this kind of Eden, which explains why you have Blake writing Jerusalem and Wordsworth and the other romantics. And I suppose, Alan, you have posited, if I've gotten you right, that the modern world, which you've just outlined there, effectively came about because of the English and their particular ways of seeing. And is there anything else that ultimately has led to the world that we see around us today that we perhaps don't realize comes downstream from all of those things we've been talking about?
Well, it's a whole other session, really, but see, when we talk about contract, most people think it's a bit of paper which you sign. We're using contract in the 19th century sociological sense. It's an agreement, a freely entered into agreement where both parties decide that they're going to do something. And that agreement can be very, very small. When you get on a bus, you enter into a contract with the driver that you're not going to suddenly stand up and shoot him or cause a row in the back of the bus or anything. Every action that you take, more or less, when you buy something, when you go into a public library, all these public spaces, there are contractual implications. And so in the 19th century sociologists, the idea was that most societies are based on what they call status. In other words, the position you are born into. So nearly everything in your life is determined into what position you're born. You're born into a freeman or a slave. You're born into a lower caste or an upper caste. You're born as a woman or a man, etc. So most societies are based on status almost entirely. The great sociologist and historian Sir Henry Maine said that the movement of the progressive societies, this is his famous phrase, is from status to contract. So when you progress or become modern, as we might say, you move from a world based on your birth to one based on achievement and your own efforts. So he said that Maitland, very wisely, his successor as Downing professor, said he's overdone it. There is still quite a lot of status in our world, but of course it's balanced by contract. So the relations between men and women, between father and daughter, are still there as status-related positions, but they're not as strong as in many societies. So this kind of world where you maneuver and manipulate and your destiny is in your own hands is one of the things that England has given to much of the world. I used to tell my undergraduates it was a bit like detergent. If you have an oil spill, it's all glued together, and then you put some detergent on it and it makes it split apart. And the English, wherever they went with their common law state system, which is based entirely on contract, you don't give, in traditional Chinese law, if you were prosecuting someone, you first had to find out what their status relationship was. It was entirely different if they were uncle and nephew or father and son, or if they were strangers, etc. We don't care. If you come in, if you're bringing an action, and bring an action against your parents for wrongdoing or whatever. So we have contract in our legal system, and when it spread around the world, it separated out things. It made people free. It broke down the barriers of caste and gender and whatever. And it's found in our own society historically in every sphere. You mentioned Hobbes. Of course, his theory is that you have a contractual relationship. Most people think of him as a kind of authoritarian figure with Lavasin, but he's actually a libertarian. Well, he's a proponent of freedom, because he says in the end we have the right to resist Lavasin if Lavasin is going to kill us or harm us. So he is much more, surprisingly, much more in favor of ultimate individual freedom than Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was proclaimed as a believer in great liberty and freedom, but who actually said the state, the general will, is dominant, and if the general will says you should die, you should die. Nothing else you can do, you have to. So, but Hobbes is, of course, the forerunner of Locke, who takes it further on, and Hobbes is only a later reflection of philosophers in earlier periods, writers who have taken the same view. The British political system from the medieval period was based on a contract, most famously Magna Carta. That's a contractual agreement, and Magna Carta wasn't just something new they invented. It was putting down on paper assumptions that had been there but were broken by King John. So our political system is contractual. Our religious system is contractual, because in Protestantism and Puritanism and its forerunners, you decide, I am going to worship you and you will look after me. And it's a contract. It's a personal contract. No one else intervenes. How I work it out is up to me personally. And the same in economics, in society, your parents. So every aspect of life is up to the individual will to make a deal, and as you say in Economy with Adam Smith. So ours is a peculiarly contractual civilization, very different even from across the Channel.
I think for anyone who wants to understand the world that we see around us, for example, drawing on your sections in the book that talk about what marks out a peasantry or a peasant society with a non-peasant society, i.e. England, as all of those ages which we've talked about, is that peasant societies can often be contra women's rights and pro-child marriage. And what we see in England is people not marrying till their mid-20s and having children until that point. And you even talked about how the notion that women weren't able to inherit may be true across much of the world, but actually you can find lots of records that suggested transfer between males to females, and then even when you think about where the English and the Brits then went and colonized. If you want to understand why the Americans love freedom so much, you kind of need to understand that part of English history. And it's that moment you spoke about having, which changed you, which upended your whole view of the part of the world you inhabited. I think work like yours, Alan, this deep understanding of people and peoples, that intermingling of philosophy and history and literature and everything that goes with it. I think this is the kind of work that if people were to go and get into, instead of reading the latest the latest books that are being shared on LinkedIn to supercharge your career, if you really want to understand the world that you inhabit, your kind of work is where we need to be headed, because you can have those moments of aha, all right, I can kind of understand the context of all of this now, and why things are the way they are. So anyway, I found it utterly beguiling delving into your work, and I will be delving into much more of it. Before I let you go, Alan, and I know you've already shared with me some moments in your life which changed your mind. However, I do ask all of my guests, in the spirit of thinking class, what you've changed your mind about during the course of your life that was once something that you thought was set in stone, unwavering in your belief that that was the way things were, but then it changed. And what was it that made you think differently?
Well, there are many, and we talked about some of them here, but I think one of them was, one of the deepest parts of most of us is our ideology and our belief systems. And I was brought up as a Christian, and through one of my uncles, through quite an evangelical Christian. I went to some of these boys' camps. I went to the one that John Smythe frequented a few decades later on, I'd say, Ewan Minster. So we were sent off, and we waited for our Protestant God to enter our heart and change our lives. And I 3/4 accepted it, but there was always these deep questions, particularly sort of late teenage questions of how could God have created this terrible mess? In other words, pain, sin, etc. Because if he was all loving and all powerful, surely and all intelligent, he could have thought of a way of both having free will and having pain-free existence for the human beings. And the whole Garden of Eden story seemed monstrous as I read it in Milton and so on, increasingly, because if God hadn't wanted Adam to sin, why did he put the serpent there, etc. So I'm questioning, and when I went to university as an undergraduate, I questioned more and more, and I still remain formally a Christian and a monotheistic believer. And then when I went to the Himalayas in Nepal, it was in one way a great relief, because I came across a society which didn't believe in God, a God. They were partly Hindu, they were partly Buddhist, they were partly shamanic, they were partly ancestral. And so I found a small society which got on perfectly well ethically and socially without a monotheistic religion. And then when I went to Japan, I found the same thing on a larger scale. And then when I went to China, I found it on a huge scale. And I discovered that 3/4 of the world doesn't believe in monotheistic religions, and they get on perfectly well without it. And so the whole weight of sin and contradiction was largely lifted off me, and I found some sort of peace in non-religious philosophies like Buddhism. And I think this is certainly one of the turning points in my life.
Well, that is a bombshell to finish on, insofar as we could talk for hours more about how we English and British have grappled with that question over the centuries. Alan, I've kept you long enough, and we started late because of technical issues, which were my doing. So thank you very much for your enduring patience, for coming on, for being so generous with your time. I can't promise that I won't be peppering you with other emails in the future asking you to come back on so I can talk about more of your work. So I do hope I'm able to speak to you again. But in the meantime, thank you very much. This has been one of my favorite conversations on the show, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Do pepper me.
All the best.
And you.
To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.